Certainly not everybody was happy with the new order. In fact, many samurai were unhappy with this new order. Many had failed to adapt economically, and many were just unhappy about the political trend that the country was taking. Many of them felt the new government was betraying the traditions of the samurai class, but many also opposed the government for other reasons. Remember, I was telling you about a debate in government about whether or not to invade Korea. This came to a head in 1874, and many people, including Saigo Takamori from Satsuma, they were forced out of the government. Well, Satsuma actually became somewhat of a magnet for disaffected samurai, and until there was actually a rebellion there in 1877. Now, some of you may have seen a rather unfortunate movie starring Tom Cruise as the last samurai of all things. And that movie is, I mean, if I give my professional opinion on it, it's a really silly movie. But it is based very loosely on this event. It presents the samurai rebels as these romantic figures yearning for the past. Really, that's really simplistic. Many of the people who participated in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 were indeed romantic, and many were indeed looking to recreate a time that was now gone forever. But really, they were not these starry-eyed romantics. Rather, they were, in many cases, desperate people for whom this was the last chance. And in many cases, they were people who were fighting against the new government in order to create a better new government. This certainly was the case with Saigo, who was always claiming that he was not rebelling against the rightful government, certainly not against the emperor. He just wasn't happy with how things were going, and he wanted to change certain things. Basically, this was a fight over who was going to control Japan. It actually started out as a fight over a garrison, and this garrison contained some very important artillery. This was in the regional center of Kumamoto in Kyushu, and so even the cause of the war was this modern weaponry. This is a very romanticized print from the from just after the Satsuma Rebellion, and presents, as many prints do, the samurai in the Satsuma rebels in this traditional garb, fighting against a modern, equipped enemy. And in many cases, this really isn't accurate. People on both sides did have access to modern weaponry, although the rebels were at a disadvantage there. But basically, this was a very bitter struggle that took most of the, that took many of the former members of the Meiji government who were from Satsuma out of the equation. Saigo was forced to commit suicide. The central government did reassert its authority in Kyushu, and also had to reassert its authority amongst all of the previously loyal imperial domains. There were insurrections in Hizen, in Choshu itself, in Fukuoka, in northern Kyushu, in these former areas of in these loyalist domains, basically. And so as a result of all of these rebellions, including the Satsuma Rebellion, the imperial government was able to kind of take care of its enemies, who basically for whom the new government in some ways was not radical enough, or a government which had personally slighted them in some ways, or a government which was on the opposite side of not being radical enough, was too radical. Many people were unhappy with cutting samurai stipends, and many of them found their way to these rebellions. And after these rebellions were done, the central government found itself in better control of the country. As I said, many of the former people from Satsuma were gone, not all of them, but an interesting side effect of these rebellions was that more and more men from Choshu came to control the government. And by the time you, in the 1880s, when you get the promulgation of the Constitution, when the government is formalized, many of the very top oligarchs come from Choshu, and only a handful come from the other domains. But basically this kind of process of, if you want to compare it to blacksmithing, maybe hammering out impurities from the noble body of the new Japan, this is certainly how some of them might have seen it. This process was one that ended in the favor of the new government. It was not overthrown. There was also another kind of resistance, which was popular resistance to the new government, known as the Freedom and People's Rights Movement. Almost immediately after the Restoration, it became clear that the hopes of many of the more populist-minded, politically active people in Japan were about to be dashed. The central government was increasingly more and more centralized. It had amassed a great amount of power, and many people, including many commoners, were very unhappy with this. And so you saw, really for the first time in Japanese history, the process of activism, of popular activism, and popular activism often in the face of great repression by the government. People mobilized and demanded, before the promulgation of the Constitution, they were demanding a constitution. And not only that, they were demanding a constitution that took people's concerns, that is, the concerns of the great majority of the government outside of the charmed circle, the majority of the people outside of the charmed circle of these mostly Choshu oligarchs, that took the wishes of people like that into account. Women participated in this movement, which was truly shocking to some members of the government establishment. Of course, the Meiji state created a police force and spied on these people, broke up their meetings, passed all sorts of restrictive legislation, and this movement, in many instances, was actually one that was headed by former heroes of the Meiji Restoration. The most well-known of which is Itagaki Taisuke, one of these legendary commanders during the Meiji Restoration, a man from Tosa, not Satsuma, not Choshu, but one of these secondary domains, which were nevertheless part of the imperial camp. But basically somebody who felt frozen out of the new government, and also somebody who wanted to attack Korea in 1874. Once again, great way to give many unemployed samurai a job, and also to, beat up people who don't realize that Japan is the greatest country ever, and to gain kind of a client state in Asia, in the same way that the Europeans were doing. These activists did agitate for increased popular participation in government, but it must be said that many of the other issues they also advocated for were issues like the invasion of Korea. So please don't romanticize these people. Don't think of them as great and noble figures, or at least it's not that simple. These were, it may be tempting to paint them as basically in the same camp as, people in the Occupy movement or whatever modern protest movement you happen to think favorably on. But really what these people wanted was a kind of imperial democracy. And this was a movement that lost much of its steam with the promulgation of the imperial constitution and the establishment of the Diet in 1889 and 1890 respectively. I think earlier I said that the constitution was promulgated in 1888. It's actually 1889. My apologies. But also this movement had in many ways its knees cut out from underneath it by repression, by increased police surveillance, and it petered out. Although many of the people who participated in this movement were themselves forever changed, many of them remained politically active, and many of them took part in the increasingly active political life of the imperial parliament, the imperial diet, in the early 20th century. The history of Japanese representative democracy is also absolutely fascinating and complex, but really beyond the scope of this course. Just be aware that the formation of the Meiji government, the abolition of the status system, the infighting within the Meiji government about what direction the new state should take, how aggressive it should be with its neighbors, all of these things are kind of working themselves out, and this is all a result, in large part at least, a result of the breakdown of the system of samurai rule that Japan had known for close to a millennium, singular. And so we've come to the end. The samurai certainly are with us in many ways, as I've said. Their descendants are with us, absolutely. And their legacy continues to be with us, and there's nothing we can do in this way to be rid of them. The afterlife of the samurai is, in many cases, a story of pure mythologizing. And for some, this is understandable. Consider, for example, in some ways this is understandable. So consider, for example, our notions of Bushido. You pronounce Bushido in Japanese, but Americanize it Bushido. And this is, supposedly the code of the samurai. Samurai are honorable. All of these things that we've talked about, paragons of virtue, blah blah blah. Where these ideas are introduced into the West in a coherent form. And when this is really important, there was a person by the name of Nitabe Inazo in 1899 who was living in the States. I forget, gosh, I shouldn't forget these things, but I think he was somehow involved with Harvard University, or Harvard College as it was at that time. But in any case, he had married a American woman. Many of his friends were American. He was living in the States, and he really, really wanted to explain to his friends and his wife where he came from, and he was of samurai descent, and he had formed in his mind a very sterilized and very noble and very kind of mythical idea of what samurai were supposed to be, and he wrote this book in English called Bushido, The Soul of Japan. Wrote this in 1899, and this book became a runaway success and became the vehicle by which many people even today are exposed to the samurai. And many moderns, of course, read this book and they say, oh, that is what the samurai were like. This is Bushido and, this warrior code. Well, as I said throughout this course, there were many warrior codes, as many codes as there were samurai, really, and by far not all of them were written down, but enough of them were to make it clear that Bushido, while certainly there was this idea, it was not this monolithic thing, as in this is Bushido and everything else isn't. But nevertheless, Nitobe is given credit, and rightly given credit, I think, for greatly increasing the interest of Westerners and people outside Japan in Japanese culture. And though his book is really not a very trustworthy piece of evidence for samurai history, it is absolutely fascinating and absolutely invaluable for chronicling the afterlife of the image of the samurai. So there were kind of these types of works, and in Japan certainly there were also works published in Japanese dealing with these same subjects, and there was more and more as Japan militarized during the 1920s. Well, actually, even before that, throughout the whole imperial period, Japan was, with some exceptions, becoming a more and more militarized country, with some exceptions. But basically, throughout this whole period, the legacy of the samurai as fearless warriors was kind of sublimated into Japanese culture and kind of became part and parcel of what it meant to be Japanese, to the extent that people today in Japan equate things that they themselves note as bushi, descended from bushi values, warrior values. They equate things like being stoic, for example, with being Japanese, with showing proper deference with being Japanese, and this they also think is an exclusively warrior trait. There's a great deal of creatively incorporating elements of the samurai legacy into all parts of Japanese culture, as we've seen with the arts, with the traditional samurai arts of No, and with things like Kyudo, which, if you remember my experience with Kyudo, it wasn't a very happy one, but, it's great that I got to try it. These things certainly get exported to the West as well. This militarized legacy during the wartime period was put into use with a vengeance. There was a cult of suicide in the Imperial Japanese Army in the face of defeat. The famous Banzai charges, I'm sure you've heard of these. The idea that you'd rather be captured than suffer the dishonor, that you'd rather die than suffer the dishonor of being captured. A lot of this comes from a very twisted and not entirely accurate understanding of samurai warfare. People were captured all the time. Yeah, people died all the time too, but it certainly wasn't unknown for samurai to end up captured. Unquestioning obedience to your superiors, and finally the act of suicide as a war tactic. And of course here I am talking about the Special Attack Corps, commonly known in the West as the kamikaze.